Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today we are going over my top 10 fantasy and sci-fi books that I would recommend to other people to get them into fantasy and sci-fi. This is my 2021 update for this list. I've been seeing other people doing this and I thought I would throw my hat in the ring and give it a red hot go. Now before we even get into it, you might find that books that you love or books that you think should definitely be in the top list of fantasy and sci-fi, and especially books to recommend to people, your picks for this list might not be on this list. And if you can think of better books, please comment them down below. These are just the books that I have read and I can guarantee are good or are good beginner stories. So please don't feel slighted if you find that one of the books or stories that you love is not on this list. I can only recommend books that I have read myself. And I am going to jump straight into it with Shadow and Bone. Now this shouldn't really be too much of a surprise. This is a great entryway into, say, fantasy stories, because it is quite popular in the media right now. There is the Netflix adaptation, and a lot of people tell you that the Netflix adaptation was actually pretty good. It's not too dark of a story, it's a young adult story, which makes it pretty easy to read, and it actually has a really interesting setting. So many fantasy stories run into the issue that they are all set in the exact same world. So people can get very bored of it. The thing that Shadow and Bone has got going for it is that it is set in a completely different world to regular fantasy. Regular fantasy is set in, say, medieval Europe. Shadow and Bone is set in Russia during the Gunpowder Age. So it is actually a really hot new take on the fantasy trope. And it could be just what people need to get into this genre. But in saying that, there are far better stories that you could read. This one is just one that is hot in the media right now, and it would be easy for people to get into because you've got an adaptation that is pretty good, and there is a huge growing fan base behind it. So you'd be able to talk to a lot of people, you'd be able to see a lot of funny memes, it'd just be really good to interact with it. The next book on my list is The Poppy War. So although I actually gave The Poppy War a not great review on my channel, I do think that what it does for the fantasy genre is actually awesome. Like I said in the last story, the fact that it is not set in medieval Europe does do a lot to boost the esteem of this story. A lot of people do love this story because it is set in, say, a medieval China. And it is an incredibly interesting story, it's an incredibly interesting setting and world and characters. And although it wasn't personally for me, a lot of people have found a great love for this series. So again, if you're looking for something a little bit out of the norm, if you're looking for something set in medieval China, it is an odd mix of young adult and grimdark. It does toe that line really, really weirdly. So just keep that in mind. If you're after something with a bit more lighter themes, this might not be the one for you. But it is still a great book, and it does do a lot for the fantasy genre in expanding mythologies that we can explore. The next book on the list, number 8, is I Am Legend. Now, I Am Legend, the book, is nothing like I Am Legend, the movie. They are both great, but they are both completely different. I think the only similarity that they share is that the main character's name is Robert Neville. I Am Legend, the book, follows a lone survivor in a world where everyone's turned into vampires. They're not zombies or whatever the hell they are in I Am Legend, the movie, but knowing that they are vampires does kind of explain why in the movie they are allergic to sunlight. But I Am Legend, the book, it does a lot. You follow this one man as he spirals down into like depression and alcoholism, and it's actually a pretty heavy story. And you get to see a man at his best and you get to see a man at his worst. But one of the really interesting things it does is it explores the idea of vampirism and how it could be a real thing in the real world. And I actually thought that was really interesting. But this book was going to be on my DNF. I was actually not going to finish this book because I found it too scientific at the time. I was reading it when I was only 17, and when you're that age, you don't want to be reading about all these crazy scientific explanations. But the book was only, it's only like 200 pages long or something. I think it's even less than that. So I decided to power through and finish it anyway, and I'm so glad I did, because the way that this story ends is so amazing. It is by far, in my opinion, the best ending to a story I've ever read. And it actually changed the way that I read books. I say this all the time, I Am Legend changed the way that I read books. I no longer DNF books because if I don't enjoy a story but it lands the ending spectacularly, then it will redeem itself in my eyes. So if you want to see what a fantastic ending to a story looks like, look at I Am Legend. Next on my list, and number 7, and to no one's surprise, Harry Potter. Harry Potter is one of those stories that everyone has to read at least once in their lifetime. Even if you're not into the idea of young adult or wizards or whatever, the fact is J.K. Rowling did a really good job of growing her characters with her audience, of appropriately aging her characters. You get to see them as kids and they grow into puberty-riddled teenagers. And you get to feel them at their awkwardness, you get to feel them at their best, you get to feel them at the worst. And even in my least favorite book, Order of the Phoenix, which a lot of people seem to love, Harry Potter was incredibly angsty as a teen, and I hated it. I hated that book because I hated how much of a crybaby Harry was. But a lot of people love it because of that. A lot of people love that she captured that teen angst so well. So although you might not like J.K. Rowling's, and if you don't want to support her, I'm sure someone's got a free copy of Harry Potter you could read. The fact is, that story did do a lot for the fantasy genre, and it is a great starting point for young people and older people alike. And in my opinion, it won't be too long before it's considered a classic. Number 6, and next on my list, is The Witcher. Now, I'd always heard about The Witcher in passing, but I'd never really given it a second thought, until one day I heard that the Netflix season was going to come out, and I thought, there's no better time than right now to throw my hat in the ring and give this book a read. And I am so glad that I did, because The Witcher did something really good for the way that I read stories. Usually I only read stories that were quite fast-paced and quite action-heavy. And I went into The Witcher thinking it would be a fast-paced, action-heavy story. But if you've read that series, then you would know that that's not actually the case. The story is actually a lot more intellectual. It's a lot more intelligent than you would think it would be, because Geralt solves all of the problems as much with violence as he does with talking out the problems. He's just as likely to help a monster as he is to kill it. But more than that, there's a lot of political maneuvering, there's a lot of overarching political structure and stories and scheming and all that, and that was never something I really went in for. I always thought that kind of thing was really boring in stories. Because I don't follow politics in real life, why would I follow politics in my leisure time? But honestly, The Witcher struck such a great balance between magic and action and intelligent critical thinking and that politics, that it really made me not mind so much that big, long, political, drawn-out, boring scenes. And from that newfound appreciation for those political scenes, I was able to start reading a lot more Brandon Sanderson. And I love Brandon Sanderson stories. And I've also moved into reading The Wheel of Time. So for me, The Witcher was a great stepping stone into those more intellectual, political, scheming, maneuvering kind of stories. Number 5, and next on my list, is The Princess Bride. Now, I've said this a couple of times, I accidentally came across The Princess Bride because when I was writing my first book, I was trying to read more romance novels to see how romance is written in stories, because romance was never really something I read. And I'd heard of The Princess Bride a couple of times in my life, but I always thought it would be terrible. I thought it would be like The Princess Diaries, I thought it would be like a chick flick, and just something that not a lot of guys would enjoy. So I got The Princess Bride, and I read it, and I'm so glad that I did. This book and the movie is a cult classic for a reason. The story is fantastic, the characters are so lovable and just amazing. This story, I cannot even explain why it's so good. It's something that you just have to experience to understand it. And if you have not read the book and you have not seen the movie, read the book first and then watch the movie. It's better that way, trust me. Next on my list, and number 4, is The Martian. So The Martian was actually one of the first sci-fi books that I ever read. And it was unlike any story that I'd really read before, because the story is actually incredibly simple. It's about a guy on Mars that just needs to survive for a certain amount of days. So in theory, it's actually a pretty simple story. There's no aliens out to get him, he doesn't have to fight for his life, he doesn't have to do this, that, or the other. It's just a man and his brain trying to figure out how to survive on Mars for X amount of days. The thing that makes this story so great is that Mark Watney, so the main character, his character is so interesting and so engaging, and just a character that you really want to spend your time with. It's something like Castaway on Mars. And there isn't really too much more I can say about that, but if you're after a really kind of thinking man's book, this is a good one, because there is just a lot of technical mumbo-jumbo engineering speak that I had no idea about. Like when he's trying to create water and he's talking about burning gases and all this other stuff, there's like 10 pages of just technical math equations and like elemental equations, and I was just lost. I had no idea. And there's a few different parts that are like that, so if you're someone that is a bit more engineering minded, you would probably really enjoy that. But overall, the character is fantastic. The story is simple, but it's still really engaging, and as a good stepping stone for sci-fi, I think The Martian is a good way to go. Number 3, and the next one on my list, is Ready Player One. Now, Ready Player One is another one of those book to movie, like I Am Legend, where the book is completely different to the movie. And honestly, I am really, really glad they did that. I really enjoyed the movie and I really enjoyed the book. And I'm really glad that they changed the challenges from the books to the movies, because I got to experience new, clever ways for them to do those challenges. There is a lot of nostalgia in these stories. You'll hear a lot, whether people be giving it praise or criticism. People talk a lot about the nostalgia in this book. But for me, I found the nostalgia really welcoming, really engaging. Although I was not alive and I have no nostalgia for most of the things that are happening in this book, the way that the nostalgia is presented is so warm and inviting that it doesn't matter that you weren't there, you're not nostalgic for these things. It's so warm and inviting that you feel the nostalgia that the author wanted you to feel. But not only that, the initial idea for the entire story is also one that we just move slowly more and more towards, the whole virtual reality. How long until we have a real life oasis where more people spend their lives online? And especially after this virus where everyone is working so much more from home, it just makes sense that the next step from working from home is going to be virtual reality working from home, and then virtual reality games, and then virtual reality everything else. Ready Player One is just a really fun story. The characters can be a little questionable at times, but it's still a pretty great overall story. I would definitely recommend it. Next, and number 2 on my list, is Skyward. Now, Skyward has got to be one of the best books that I've ever read. I love Skyward. Go and check out my review for it. I did a great review. I absolutely love that story. And especially if you have any kind of interest in the military, or if you were in the military, this is a really... There's so many characters in it that will remind you so much of your time. The author, Brandon Sanderson, did such a good job of researching these people, researching how people speak, how people act, their mannerisms, their training methods, how being in a bad situation will bring people together. But not only that, the main character herself, Spencer, her journey through this book is just phenomenal. The things she goes through, how much you understand why she is the way she is, and then how she learns and changes and comes to terms with the things that have happened in her life. Really, really phenomenal story, and some of the best action that I've ever read in a book. I could not recommend Skyward enough. And finally, the last book on my list, taking it out at number 1, is Warbreaker. Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson is the best book I've ever read. There are just some ideas and themes that are explored in this story that just are incomparable to any other story. Things like justifying war. As humans, we know that justifying war is a ridiculous thing, and a lot of stories, whether they be books, movies, or TV shows, video games, or whatever, they all struggle to justify war because it is just such a ridiculous thing. But this book does such an amazing job of explaining why people can justify war, explaining how people justify war, explaining how one certain action can make both sides think that the other side started the war. The ideas and themes that are explored in this story are phenomenal. But not only that, the characters are great, but the thing that really got me was the plot twists. People often talk about Brandon Sanderson's writing and they'll say he's either great or he's terrible. Everyone always says he's got really great characters, but the thing I've been really noticing is his plot twists are fantastic, and people just don't talk about that enough. I've officially read 3 books by him now, and each different series that I've read has just had some absolutely unexpected plot twist that just threw me for a loop. And Warbreaker has had the best that I've read out of all of them. Could not recommend this book enough, although keep in mind it is more of a slower burn political story. So if that's something you hate, this might not be for you. But also you'd be surprised how enjoyable this story can be. And that's it. Like I said, comment down below what your favorite books to recommend are. Did I put these books in a good order? Do you think they should be in a different order? Do you think some of these books shouldn't be on the list at all? Let me know. Also, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and as always, thank you very much.